Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Currently Speaking, the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. I'm Bill Current, president and founder of the Current Consulting Group, and I'm joined today by Brian Feely, vice president of the Current Consulting Group. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Bill.
As many of you probably know, Brian has been in the drug testing industry for 30 plus years, including over 25 years at OraSure Technologies, the number one recognized brand in oral fluid drug testing year after year after year in our Current Consulting Group industry survey. So he's got a wealth of knowledge, and this is one of a series of podcasts on oral fluid testing. Hot topic today, a lot of basic information, even advanced information that many people in the industry need in order to help their clients and for employers to make good decisions about how to use oral fluid testing. So this series of podcasts on oral fluid testing, I think you're going to find very interesting. Check out our website to view more of these podcasts. Let's start out first today, though, talking about cutoff levels. What is a cutoff level and why is it important, Brian?
Sure, Bill. So a cutoff level is something, or some people might refer to it as a threshold, is something that's built into an immunoassay. And in a prior podcast, we talked about the term assay and immunoassay. But just for quick background, the assay is the actual test that's used for a substance, either be it marijuana or be it THC or cocaine. And so within that assay, when the developer makes that test, they consider the cutoff level, which is the level at which you're differentiating between a negative and a positive sample, right? So think about it like a screen door. If you were to, have a windy day come along and there's dust in the air, certain things are going to come through that window and certain things through that screen, and certain things aren't. And that's basically how a screen works in an assay. You're looking for a level at which if someone is positive at, that's a pretty sure positive, with not many false positives and not many false negatives. And so developers of tests develop using that threshold and cutoff. In many cases, it's what comes from the science, and even in the terms of regulated testing for DOT, they're mandated. So those cutoffs are actually set by the folks that do the literature searches and develop, the guidelines. So that's what the assay developer has to follow when it comes to regulated testing. But essentially, it's a way of which you're differentiating and calling someone negative or presumptively positive. And that presumptive positive is an interesting term. We can talk about that as well.
Okay. So there are a lot of options that employers have today. Urine testing, of course, oral fluid, hair, even breath, blood, fingernail. Is the subject of cutoff levels sort of the same from specimen to specimen, or do they differ in terms of the number that's used as the cutoff level? What's the difference?
Yeah, no, they're very different, Bill. So, urine, of course, been around for 30 plus years. The cutoffs were established a long time ago, and they're really based on the science of the breakdown of a drug in someone's body that ends up in the urine. And so what happens through that process is the body breaks down that drug into metabolites, and they essentially get concentrated in that urine sample because of the function of the liver and the bladder and the body. And so the cutoff level for something in a urine assay is quite a bit higher than what you're going to find in other sample types, than really any other sample type. So the cutoff is high because the concentration is high, and you don't need to look for minute levels of drugs in a urine sample. Oral fluid, much different. Oral fluid, as we talked about in a previous podcast, is a filtrate of your blood. And so when a drug gets into your bloodstream, it's obviously distributed across a much larger body of fluid in your blood, and it gets pushed over into the oral fluid cavity through the glands. And the concentration of that drug is quite a bit lower than what you would find in urine. So the cutoffs, therefore, have to be quite a bit lower in order for you to find the drug that you're interested in at a cutoff that will give you similar results as to what you would see in urine. That's the key. So it's not so much, how different are the cutoffs. It's that the cutoff that you establish gives you similar positive rates and a similar efficacy, if you will, of a drug testing program. So you know you're picking up drugs, you're not missing things to any large extent. And that's how the cutoffs can differ. And hair is actually even different as well compared to oral fluid and urine. A hair cutoff is probably a little more like oral fluid cutoffs in terms of the levels.
So back in October of 2019, SAMHSA came out with final guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing. Then earlier in this year, 2023, DOT issued final regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing. And of course, both already had in place regulations for urine testing, but now we can look at side by side urine and oral fluid regulations. And when you look at the cutoff levels that are now in the regulations, the numbers are different.
They are indeed.
So explain that to us.
Well, so for example, I'll further to the discussion we were just having. I'll use marijuana as the example. So a marijuana cutoff in urine is 50 nanograms per mil for the screen, for the immunoassay screen. In oral fluid, it's 4 nanograms per mil. And so it's that much lower because you basically need the assay to screen that sample at a lower level in order to give you similar results to the urine 50 nanogram per mil, if that makes sense, right? So these assays are developed to operate appropriately in the sample type that you're working with. And if you look at that SAMHSA document you're referring to, the cutoffs are also, the confirmation cutoffs are actually quite a bit lower than urine. And so they go hand in hand. Another example might be cocaine. In urine, it's a 300 nanogram per mil cutoff. In oral fluid, it's 15 nanograms per mil. So it just, varies by drug class. Of course, there have been, hundreds of studies that have been done leading up to the HHS guidelines that they referred to and they consulted with, and lots of work that went into looking at what should those cutoffs really be in order to give you a valid result and something similar to urine drug screening.
So speaking of positive drug test results, then will that differ from specimen to specimen, oral fluid to urine to hair, or are they generating basically the same level or percentage of positives?
So generally speaking, the positive rates for oral fluid and hair have been a bit higher than urine screening. And so why is that? Well, it probably will tie into a future podcast and things that we'll be talking about when it gets to the benefits of oral fluid. But one of the unique things about oral fluid is that collection procedure, and it's very difficult to beat an oral fluid test. It's really difficult to beat a hair test as well, right? Because they're all directly observed. And so what happens is, even though you've got the cutoff set sort of where they should be from a clinical standpoint, when you have a real world situation like a test being more difficult for someone to beat, you're gonna potentially find some higher positive rates with certain drug classes than you would with the other sample. Marijuana is a typical example, and we could talk about the positive rates for marijuana, in a future podcast. But essentially, the bottom line is you tend to find more marijuana positives on oral fluid than you do urine. Because of the fact that it's hard to beat the test. And so someone can't study for that test like they can for a urine test.
So, and I know we're going to get into a lot more detail about the subject of window of detection, but there's a difference, right, between the different specimens, and that could have an effect on positive results as well, couldn't it?
It certainly will.
Yeah. And is it possible? So now we have regulations for oral fluid and urine, and as of the recording of this podcast, we're still waiting for laboratories to be certified by HHS for oral fluid testing. But companies outside of the DOT regulations, for example, that are not covered under the federal regulations, can already use oral fluid testing, whether it's lab-based or rapid result, depending on the state laws that affect them. And so the question is, can you use different testing methods in the same program, say using oral fluid for post-accident and reasonable suspicion and hair testing for pre-employment, or some combination like that? And could you use one specimen for the initial test and a different specimen for the confirmation test.
Okay, so two parts to your question there, or two questions you asked.
Yeah.
One, can you use different sample types in your program? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. Based on what your goals are of your drug testing program and what you're looking to achieve, you may very well want to mix and match. And the example you gave was a good one. Oral fluid is a great way to identify recent use, and we'll be talking about this. So it's really telling you what's in someone's system right now, whether they did it this morning before work or whether they did it maybe late last night on a partying binge or whatever. When they come in the next morning, if they're positive, if their oral fluid is positive, that was a recent drug test. And by the way, to tie back to your question, even though I said that the positive rates are a little higher for marijuana and oral fluid, that really doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to lose employees because they're all going to come up positive, right? What that means is I'm going to catch more people that are very recent drug users, and urine doesn't necessarily do that. So that's why I'm getting higher positive rate with oral fluid. It's really good at picking up recent use. So intermixing in a program, hair for pre-employment, oral fluid for post-accident, reasonable suspicion is actually a very nice algorithm. Urine can even be mixed in there as well, and so it does tend to complicate the program a bit, but it can be done. One of the things that I've seen over the years is people will try that out, and when they see how easy it is to use oral fluid, they'll typically want to adopt it for their whole program. But certainly that is an option. Part two of your question was, can I use one sample to screen and another to confirm? And I would not recommend that, and most people would not, because going back to the question of windows of detection, different positive rates, you could very well get a positive in an oral fluid sample and run a urine and get a negative, because that was a recent use test, oral fluid, a recent use situation, and it didn't quite metabolize enough to get into the urine, so you get a negative. Vice versa, if you tried to do a urine for a screen and then an oral fluid, you could also have a miss on the back end. So you want to stay within the same matrix for your screen and your confirmation test.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Let's end this podcast on that note. Again, we encourage you to check our website for other podcasts with Brian on oral fluid testing and other members of the Current Consulting Group team for other subjects. Just visit us at currentconsultinggroup.com and check out our Currently Speaking page, and you'll find additional podcasts there. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Sure. Thank you.